The rain hammered against the windows of the tiny coffee shop, the soft murmur of voices drowned by the sound of nature's fury. Nosa pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she slumped into the seat across from Orsa's, her face flushed with anger, tears brimming in her eyes. "He's a jerk," Orsa's. "I can't believe I wasted 6 months on him." Her voice cracked as she hopped between frustration and heartbreak. Orsa's leaned forward, his steady gaze boring into hers. His dark eyes reflected patience, something he perfected after years of friendship with Nosa. He reached for her hand resting on the table. "You deserve better, Nosa. How many times do I have to tell you? These guys you keep picking, they don't see you for who you are." She sniffled, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "But what's wrong with me, Orsa's? Why do they always leave?" Orsa's exhaled softly, his jaw tightening. In his heart, he believed there was nothing wrong with her, except the way she chose people who didn't value her. What she didn't know, or perhaps refused to see, was that each time a man broke her heart, Orsa's was the one there to pick up the pieces. And he didn't mind. Not at first. When they were kids, Orsa's and Nosa made a pact to always be there for each other. When life got hard, they'd lean on one another. And Orsa's had upheld his side of the deal. But lately, something had been gnawing at him. Lately, that smile he wore each time he consoled her felt heavier, like a mask he was ready to remove. "You'll figure it out someday," he said with a faint smile, masking the tumultuous war in his heart. Nosa giggled softly, wiping the last of her tears. "Thank you," Orsa's. "What would I do without you?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He'd heard her say those words so many times they'd begun to sound like part of her apology for taking his loyalty for granted. As the days turned into weeks, Orsa's noticed something. Each time he met someone new and began to feel a spark, Nosa would show up with a flicker of panic in her eyes. She'd fake a crisis, call him late into the night, and somehow, those budding connections would fade. He never thought much of it before. After all, Nosa was his best friend. She needed him. But now, with every glance she threw his way, a shadow of doubt crept in. It was one evening, a dull orange sunset painting the sky, that the revelation came. Orsa sat on his balcony, scrolling absent-mindedly through messages on his phone when he stumbled on something Diane, the sweet woman he'd briefly dated 2 months earlier, had sent him before ghosting him entirely. "Orsa's, I don't think we're on the same page. Your friend, Nosa, said things about you that made me realize this can't work. You have too much going on in your life. I wish you the best." His brows furrowed, tension pulling at his chest. What had Nosa said? Why hadn't Diane told him? His mind churned with questions he couldn't answer. And then, like a whisper, the pieces began to fit together. Every relationship he'd ever tried to nurture, every spark of happiness he'd almost grasped, Nosa was always there, dismissing his choices, warning him, "She's not good enough for you," Orsa's. "I just want to make sure you're safe. Don't worry, I've got your back." Was it love? Or something else entirely? Determined to get answers, Orsa sat across from Nosa in their usual spot at the park, the sprawling oak tree casting long shadows over the cobblestone path. She bit into an apple, smiling as she recounted her hilarious misadventures from the dating app she joined a few weeks earlier. "Nosa," Orsa's interrupted, his voice firmer than usual. "Can I ask you something?" Her smile faltered, the apple frozen halfway to her lips. "Of course. It's about Diane." He didn't miss how guilt flashed across her face like lightning, gone just as fast as it came. "What about her?" Nosa asked lightly, but the way she shifted in her seat gave her away. "Why did you talk to her? What did you say?" Nosa blinked, her lips parting just enough to form a defensive reply. "I was looking out for you," Orsa's. "I wasn't sure if she was the right fit. She seemed too smooth. I thought she might be trying to take advantage. And so you told her what exactly?" "That I was trouble." Nosa shrugged as if his accusations didn't sting, but her fingers fiddled nervously with her bracelet. "I didn't lie," Orsa's. "It's not my fault if she couldn't handle the truth." Breathing deeply to steady himself, Orsa's leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Why do you keep doing this, Nosa? Why do you always plant seeds of doubt in the people I care about? Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with something unidentifiable. Was it anger? Hurt? Fear? I'm your best friend. Or says, they don't know you as I do. I've been there through everything. Your parents' divorce, your darkest nights. Who else is going to protect you? No, sir. His clenched fist rested on his knees. It's not about protecting me, is it? It's about you. You can't stand the thought of anyone else being close to me. Her breath hitched, her face pale now. She looked as though he'd struck her with a whip, but she didn't deny it. Orsis felt his world teetering. Why, no, sir. Are you afraid to lose me to someone else? She swallowed hard, tears pooling in her eyes. You're all I have, Orsis. Her voice cracked, raw with emotion. Every time I see you with someone else, I get scared. Scared you'll stop needing me. And then what will I have? Who will I be without you? His heart slammed against his rib cage as her words settled over them like a heavy fog. Nosa's vulnerability was undeniable, but so was her selfishness. He was torn between pity and frustration. He had always known Nosa to be complicated, but this was something entirely different. A startling realization struck Orsis that night as he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. For years, he had been her crutch, her stability, while she held him back from something he yearned for, something she refused to provide herself. Love. Partnership. But the question lingered, what was he going to do about it? How do you confront someone who's both your anchor and your storm? The following days were uneasy, a coldness settling between them. Nosa must have sensed the shift because she grew overly sweet and apologetic, as though trying to mend a crack that had grown too wide. It wasn't long before Orsis met Lucy, an exceptional woman with a wit as sharp as her smile. But this time, he did something different. He kept her a secret from Nosa, until the day he couldn't anymore. And when he finally introduced Lucy to Nosa, it was under the harsh light of his suspicion, his heart guarded and vigilant. Just like clockwork, Nosa began to interfere. Slight warnings, subtle manipulations. But this time, Orsis was ready. Months passed. Orsis didn't think he'd ever feel the warmth of love again. But time is a way of softening even the sharpest wounds, and eventually, his heart begins to heal. Her name was Emily. They met at a book club. She loved crime novels. He loved mystery novels. By the second meeting, they were inseparable. Emily was witty and charming, with a smile that could make even a stormy day feel like spring. Orsis felt alive around her, and for the first time since Diane, he began to believe in love again. But history, it seemed, had other plans. This time, it started with a whisper, a rumor that spread through their small social circle like wildfire. People began treating Emily differently, their eyes filled with pity or judgment. It wasn't until a mutual friend showed Orsis a post on social media that he learned why. The post accused Emily of being a sugar baby, attaching bank transactions, fake, of course, and alleged screenshots of messages between her and clients. Devastated, Emily confronted Orsis one stormy night. Do you believe them? She asked, her voice trembling as rain fell around them like shattered glass. Please, Orsis, tell me you don't believe them. I don't, he assured her. I don't. But he wasn't saying it to her anymore. He was saying it to the voice in his head, the one that sounded far too much like Nosa. But it was too late. By the following week, Emily was gone. The pattern continued, like a curse he couldn't escape. Every time he found someone, Nosa found a way to destroy it. False claims of hidden marriages, accusations of crimes they hadn't committed, even rumors of medical conditions that turned out to be lies. With every failed relationship, Orsis fell deeper and deeper into despair. And Nosa, she was always there, her arms wide, her voice soft. You'll always have me, Orsis. I'm all you need. But even the darkest night must end. Orsis, reeling from yet another heartbreak, stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see. An email on Nosa's computer detailing her instructions to a private investigator. It wasn't just about Emily. It was about all of them. Every single one of the women he'd loved had been a target in Nosa's twisted game of control. For the first time, Orsa saw the truth. Nosa wasn't protecting him. She was protecting her power over him. She wasn't his savior. She was his jailer. With trembling hands, Orsa's printed the evidence. It would be the key to his freedom. Orsa's walked into the dawn of a new life, his heart lighter, his eyes brighter, and for the first time in years, he didn't look back. The stars blanketed the night sky, their faint twinkle mirrored by the calm waters of the lake. Orsa's and Nosa sat side by side on the wooden dock, legs dangling over the edge. A cooler with half-filled cans of soda and melting ice sat between them, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and summer grass. "Do you ever think about the future?" Orsa's asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Nosa glanced at him, then back at the stars. "Sometimes. It's hard not to." "What do you see?" he pressed, curious. "When you think about your life in, say, 5 or 10 years? She sighed softly, hugging her knees to her chest. "I don't know. I guess. I want to be happy." He smiled faintly. "That's a bit vague, don't you think?" She chuckled lightly. "Fine. I want someone who makes me happy. Someone kind. Someone patient. Someone who listens, you know? Someone who doesn't make me feel like loving them is a chore." Orsa's felt his pulse quicken as her words washed over him. Kind. Patient. Someone who listens. She could have been describing him. Was she? He glanced at her profile, her face illuminated by the silvery glow of the moon. He wanted to ask, wanted to know, but the lump in his throat wouldn't let him speak. "You deserve that," he finally said, his voice quiet. "You deserve someone who treats you the way you deserve to be treated." She turned to him then, her eyes meeting his. "So, do you, Orsa's? You deserve someone who sees you for who you are. You have this way about you. You make people feel safe." He swallowed hard, the words catching in his chest like hooks. She saw him, truly saw him. Was it possible that after all this time, after all the heartbreak and disappointment, the person he had been looking for had been sitting beside him all along? But before he could respond, her phone buzzed on the dock. She glanced at the screen, her brows knitting together. "It's late," she muttered, typing a quick reply before setting the phone down. "Work stuff?" Orsa's nodded, though he couldn't shake the nagging curiosity. Who texts about work this late? It was little things like this, little inconsistencies, that always left him questioning everything and everyone. But Nosa wasn't like the others, was she? She was different. She had to be. Still, the doubt clawed at him. What if he was wrong? What if he opened his heart to her, only to have it torn apart again? "Let's make a deal," Nosa said suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts. "A deal?" he repeated. She nodded, smiling. "We promise not to settle for anything less than the love we deserve. No more compromising. No more heartbreaks. Deal." He hesitated, then held out his hand. "Deal." As their hands clasped, he felt an electric jolt race up his arm. Maybe it was just his imagination, or maybe it was something more. Either way, as he released her hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For better or worse, his life was about to change. 3 nights later, Orsa's decided he couldn't keep it in anymore. The silent weight of his feelings had become unbearable, and he knew that if he didn't speak up, he'd regret it forever. Secretly, he rehearsed in front of the mirror in his tiny mud-walled room. He practiced every sentence 100 times, changing the words slightly until it felt just right. He waited until they were back under the baobab. Tonight, the moon was full, casting a pale light across the landscape. Nosa was lying on the grass, staring up at the sky, sighing over something trivial. She always sighed like that when she felt at peace. Orsa's leaned against the tree and took a deep breath. "Nosa," he started, and she turned her head towards him. I need to tell you something." "Sure, what is it?" she said easily, completely unaware of the storm brewing in his chest. He straightened up and faced her fully. "I don't know how to say this without sounding stupid, but you're my best friend. You know that, right? She smiled warmly. Of course. You're mine too. I hope you always will be. His heart tightened at that. That's the thing. I don't just see you as my best friend, Nosa. He paused, trying to steady his voice. You mean more to me than that. A lot more. Suddenly still, her face changed ever so slightly. She was still lying on the grass, but she looked up at him now with wide, unblinking eyes. I think I've loved you for a long time, he continued softly, his palms damp from nerves. Maybe I didn't see it at first, but I know it now. You're everything I want. You're the one I want. Silence. The cool night air seemed to tighten around them, becoming stifling. Orses waited for a response, a smile, a kind word, anything. But when Nosa finally sat up, her expression sent a jolt through his chest. She looked uncomfortable. Oh, Orses, she started, and just from her tone, he knew where this was going. Her words came too fast, like she wanted to get them over with before they hurt too much. I don't feel the same way. I don't know if I ever will. You're like a brother to me. My closest friend. I couldn't risk losing that. He blinked. It was like the ground had vanished beneath him. I'm sorry, she said, her voice genuine and soft. He managed to force a smile, even though his heart was splintering into 100 tiny shards inside him. It's okay, he lied. I understand, but the words burned on his tongue. Nosa reached out and touched his arm. She meant well, but the gesture felt wrong now, almost cruel. I hope this doesn't change anything, she said earnestly. It won't, he said quickly, though he wasn't sure he believed himself. Good. She smiled weakly. Because you're too important to me, Orses. I don't want to lose you. He nodded, pretending her words weren't another knife to his chest. They spent the rest of the evening like they always did, talking, laughing, sharing small secrets, but it wasn't the same. It would never be the same. As Nosa walked home later that night, leaving him under the baobab, Orses sat there alone, staring into the darkness. Something inside him had shifted. Something inside him had broken. And deep down, he wondered if it would ever heal. By the third day, the sadness gave way to anger. Orses buried himself in work, taking up extra shifts at the cafe he managed. The more he worked, the less he had to confront the emotions clawing at his chest. He convinced himself he was fine, but Nosa noticed. Every time she came to the cafe for her usual iced latte, Orses would keep conversations brief, flashing her the same distant smile he gave to strangers. He wouldn't ask her about her day, or tease her the way he used to. When her sketch pad sat on the table in front of her, he avoided glancing at her drawings. She felt the change like a knot in her stomach. It wasn't the warmth she was used to. Instead, it was cold, mechanical. She told herself it would pass. Maybe he just needed time. But weeks passed and nothing changed. Are you free tonight? She asked one evening when he brought her drink to the table. Orses hesitated. Got some inventory work to finish up. Maybe another time. You've been saying that a lot lately, she said before catching herself. She didn't want to sound accusatory. She just wanted her friend back. He forced another smile. Busy season, you know how it is. But Nosa wasn't convinced. She could see the shadows under his eyes, the light in them dimmed. He wasn't okay, and she didn't know how to fix it. Later that night, she called him. Hello. He answered on the third ring, his tone distant as ever. It's me, she said. I know, Orses replied, his voice flat. Can we talk? Nosa asked softly. I'm kind of in the middle of something, he said, though she could hear the faint clang of dishes in the background, signaling he was home. She hesitated. You're not okay, are you? He stopped whatever he was doing. What's that supposed to mean? You've been avoiding me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. And if it's because of what happened under the flame tree, then we need to talk about it. There's nothing to talk about, Nosa, Orses replied, his words sharper than she expected. You were honest, and I respect that. End of story. But we're not okay, are we? She pressed. I don't want to lose this, Orses. I don't want to lose you. He let out a humorless laugh, bitterness seeping into his reply. You're not losing me, Nosa. I'm right here. Always have been. Then why does it feel like you've built a wall between us? She asked, her voice breaking. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I'm just tired, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's all. Good night, Nosa. And before she could say anything more, the line clicked dead. In the lonely quiet of his apartment, Orses leaned his forehead against the wall, his fists clenched at his sides. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, one he wasn't sure he could find his way out of. But the thing he hadn't realized yet was that the shadows creeping into his life weren't entirely his. Something darker was waiting just out of sight, something that would turn their world inside out in ways neither of them could have imagined. And when it came, neither Orses nor Nosa would be ready. It was a Monday morning when the rust-covered moving van drove up the slim road leading into town. It stopped in front of an old bungalow near the town's edge, the kind of house most people overlooked. The driver's door swung open and out stepped a man. He was tall, lean, and moved like someone who had somewhere better to be. There was confidence in him, not the overbearing, loud kind, but the sort that knew how to make silence work in its favor. His name, as the whispers soon revealed, was Sunday, an engineer sent by one of the big companies working on a construction project outside town. But Sunday wasn't just any engineer. He was sharp, brilliant even. Within hours, the small town was abuzz. The local carpenter who had been hired to help with some repairs at Sunday's new home told anyone who would listen, "That man talks." Oh, but he talks like people do in the big city. And talk he did. By Friday, Sunday had wormed his way into the lives of everyone who mattered in Kamma. He attended community discussions, shared stories that had the elders laughing deep into the night, and even helped fix Mrs. Dorothy's stubborn generator. Between his easy charm, sharp intelligence, and knack for picking up new names after hearing them once, Sunday was a man who knew how to make himself unforgettable. It wasn't long before he met Nosa. She was at the local library when Sunday first approached her. She had been sitting cross-legged near the back shelves, half absorbed in the same book she'd been rereading for years. He greeted her with a voice that was warm yet curious. His tone held no hesitancy, as though he had been approaching her his entire life. "You're Nosa, right?" he asked, tilting his head like he already knew the answer. "Have we met?" she had replied, raising an eyebrow but unable to hide the slight twist of intrigue tugging at her lips. "No," Sunday said, a slight grin forming. "But I hear things. Good things." Somehow, in those first few minutes, Sunday put her at ease in a way that surprised her. There was no awkward fumbling to find conversation topics. No pretense. Only a natural flow that kept her on her toes. Days turned to weeks, and Sunday's presence seeped into her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. They'd sit for hours talking. Or rather, he'd talk and she'd hang on to every word. He was funny. Funny in the way that made her laugh painfully hard, even at jokes that had no business being that hilarious. She hadn't smiled this much in years, and even her friend Clara told her the other day, "Whatever glow you found, bottle it." Sell it. But it wasn't just laughter. It was the way Sunday listened. He'd lean in as she spoke, nodded when it mattered, and asked questions that made her pause, as though peeling back layers she didn't know existed. With Sunday, she felt seen in ways she hadn't realized she craved. Orses noticed. He noticed the laughter, of course, how it sounded richer, fuller, louder. He noticed the spark in her eyes when she walked through the market, the way her steps carried a lightness that had been missing for what felt like years. And he noticed Sunday, too. The man who had filled her silences with the conversation replaced her frowns with smiles and lit up the parts of her that Orses had thought were unknowable to anyone but him. For the first time, Orses saw it clearly. He was being replaced. Valentine's Day arrived with its sugary cliches. Heart-shaped decorations adorned storefronts, local radio stations played old love ballads, and the air seemed tinged with romance. For Orses, it was a day he both dreaded and anticipated. Every year, he bought Nosa a small yet thoughtful gift. Nothing too flashy, nothing overwhelming. Just enough to make her smile, to keep their friendship intact, to remind her, without saying it outright, that she meant something to him. This year was no different. He had searched high and low for the perfect present. A delicate silver bracelet with a small charm, the letter N for Nosa. It felt significant, but not too bold. That afternoon, as Orsa stood outside her house, the box bracelet tucked under his arm, he felt a sick twist in his stomach. Why was he nervous? Why were his palms clammy? His breath short? Why did he feel like the bracelet weighed 1,000 pounds? He took a deep breath and stepped in. The moment he entered Nosa's living room, he regretted it. The place was alive, friends chatting loudly, the smell of freshly baked goods lingering in the air, soft music playing in the background. It was festive and warm, and yet it felt like no one noticed Orsa standing there, awkwardly clutching his tiny gift. No one except Sunday. That is, Sunday stood near the center of the room, holding court like a king among his subjects. He wore a fitted blazer, his easy smile dazzling the group gathered around him. Nosa was beside him, her head tilted in laughter, her hand lightly grazing his forearm as he spoke. Orsa's froze. For a moment, the world blurred, the voices dulled. He felt like a shadow, invisible, a forgotten relic in Nosa's orbit. Orsa's, she called, spotting him at last. Her voice carried her usual cheer, but there was no urgency in it, no excitement. He forced a smile and approached, handing her the bracelet in a clumsily wrapped box. "Happy Valentine's Day, Nosa," he said, his voice quieter than intended. "Ah, this is so sweet, thank you," she said, barely glancing at it before setting it aside. Her attention returned to Sunday almost immediately. "By the way, you haven't met everyone, right?" she added, motioning toward the group. Orsa's went through the motions of introductions, but his heart wasn't in it. Each new face, each polite handshake, only emphasized how out of place he felt. And the worst part, the quiet yet undeniable bond between Sunday and Nosa. It wasn't just in their words. It was the way they stood close, the way her eyes lit up whenever he spoke, the way his confidence drew her in like a magnet. The party stretched on, each moment an unbearable ache for Orsa's. He retreated to a corner, nursing a cup of punch he didn't really want. His mind raced, torn between wanting to leave and needing to stay. And then it happened. He overheard Sunday talking to Nosa. At first, it was casual, about his challenging projects as an engineer, his travels, his plans to finally settle down and put roots somewhere. But then Sunday tilted his head, his expression softening. "You're different, you know," he said to Nosa, his voice low. "There's something special about you." Orsa's heart clenched. He couldn't take it anymore. With a rushed goodbye, barely waiting for anyone to acknowledge him, he slipped out the door and into the cold night. Outside, the air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. Clutching his coat tightly, Orsa's walked aimlessly down the empty streets, his mind churning with angry, confused thoughts. Had he waited too long? Did Sunday really care for her? Or was he just charming everyone like he always seemed to do? Was there even a chance for him anymore? As he rounded a corner, his fist tightened unconsciously. No, he couldn't let this end like this. Whatever it took, Orsa's would find a way to hold on to Nosa. And he would figure out what Sunday's intentions truly were. Because something deep inside him whispered, this wasn't over. As the evening wore on, Orsa's found himself unable to fully engage with the chatter around him. His eyes kept darting to Nosa and Sunday. They flowed together with a kind of ease Orsa's hadn't seen before. Every small gesture between them was filled with a quiet familiarity that made his skin crawl. He saw Sunday's hand brush ever so lightly against Nosa's as they reached for the same wine bottle. He saw her blush when Sunday whispered something in her ear. He heard her laugh the way she used to with him when it felt like they were the only two people in the world. He stared at the red candlelight flickering on the table and clenched his fist under the table, so tightly, it was a wonder they didn't draw blood. His mind was a storm now, memories and thoughts swirling like a dark vortex. How many times had they met recently without him knowing? Was this why she'd been distant? And what if she had moved on and he was the only one who hadn't realized it? A new thought slithered into his head. black and venomous. What if she never needed you at all? The words dug their claws into him and clung tight. His mind fought against them, but deep down he knew they had always been there. Like weeds buried in the soil, they had been waiting for the right moment to sprout. He glanced up at her again. She looked so happy, her laughter filling the air, her eyes sparkling. And it wasn't for him. His chest felt like it was caving in. The invitation, the party, it wasn't for him. He'd let himself believe that maybe this was Nosa's way of drawing closer again. But now, watching her radiant under the glow of candlelight while Sunday leaned in with that knowing, confident smirk, Orsis felt sick to his core. "I'll be back," he mumbled suddenly, rising from his seat. Nosa glanced up at him, her forehead creased with concern. "Are you okay?" "I just need some air," he said, forcing a faint smile. It wasn't a lie. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, and the laughter ringing in his ears sounded distant and warped. Orsis stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars above blinked brightly, indifferent to the storm in his chest. He inhaled deeply, but the weight inside him refused to lift. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photos of Nosa and himself. There they were, walking by the beach, grinning like fools at the camera, caught in one of those rare moments that made time feel infinite. It wasn't supposed to end like this. A creeping shadow passed over his face as a darker thought whispered. Maybe it didn't have to. The night crept on, but Orsis remained rooted in place. The room around him felt colder now, as though the walls absorbed his despair and mirrored it back to him. His gaze had not moved from the garden. Suddenly, they both stood, Nosa and Sunday, side by side, their laughter fading into casual conversation. Orsis's pulse quickened when Sunday gestured toward the back garden, toward the maze of trees that lined the edge of the property. They were walking toward it. Orsis rose from his seat instinctively, his movements slow but deliberate. His focus sharpened, and every fiber of his being zeroed in on their movement. The shadows from the garden lights cast vague shapes as they drifted further back until they disappeared completely into the darkness of the trees. His nostrils flared. Something primal surged inside him, a need to reclaim what was his. Without consciously deciding, his hand reached into his jeans pocket. His fingertip grazed against the cold steel of the small, familiar knife he carried. He didn't bring it for this. No, it had a sweeter, more innocent purpose. He was going to carve their initials into that old mahogany tree in the garden. Nosa loved things like that, a physical symbol of their love, forever engraved in the bark. But that purpose felt off now. As his fingers curled around the knife and pulled it free, it didn't feel like a tool of love anymore. It felt like something else entirely. The night enveloped him as he moved, his light footsteps nearly inaudible against the cool grass. He slipped between the curtains of leaves, his breathing shallow as he caught sight of them again. They weren't far ahead, walking slowly as they talked in hushed voices. But he didn't need to hear their conversation to know it was dangerous, to feel the way Nosa's attention was too glued to Sunday, too eager. Was Sunday stealing her away piece by piece? Or was it her decision all along? The knife felt heavier in his hand, or maybe it was his thoughts that weighed him down. He hesitated briefly, hiding in the shadows, his eyes burning holes into the pair as they stopped beneath the towering mahogany tree. This was the same tree where he once promised to carve their love into eternity. He laughed bitterly under his breath. Eternity was starting to feel like a fleeting thing. Orsis watched as Sunday reached up, plucking a small branch from the tree. Nosa giggled again, her hand brushing his as she took the branch and tucked it into her hair like a flower. The sight made Orsis's stomach churn. Then it happened. Sunday reached out, not a casual touch this time, but deliberate. His hand settled on Nosa's arm, his thumb brushing against her skin. Her expression softened, her cheeks glowing in the faint moonlight. That was all it took to undo Orsis. Something snapped within him, like the sound of that breaking branch. Before he knew it, his feet moved forward, his breath heavier, the gleam of steel in his hand catching the faint light. He didn't know what he was going to do. He didn't even know if he cared anymore. But he knew one thing with chilling certainty. That small knife wasn't going to carve initials tonight. It had a purpose now, and Orses wasn't sure he could stop it. The Carter party began to dwindle within the hour. Guests filed out in small groups, calling out polite farewells as the night deepened. Orses watched from a distance as Nosa mingled briefly inside the house. The pink scarf draped over her shoulders, making her easy to spot in the crowd. His gaze darted over her, hyper-aware of every casual interaction she had, every time someone else made her laugh. It felt like the world was mocking him, showing him how easy it was for others to claim pieces of her. By the time the last guests were leaving, Sunday lingered by the side of the house, helping the Carters move some of the tables indoors. Orses followed his movements from just beyond the porch, hovering where the shadow of the house stretched out over the garden. He waited, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. And then, when Sunday finally stepped into the garden alone, that familiar ribbon of fear and anger laced through him again. Orses stepped out of the shadows. Sunday froze at first, startled by the sudden appearance. Then he smiled. "Orses," he said lightly. "Didn't know you were still here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Orses' fingers brushed against the knife in his pocket. He hadn't thought this through. He hadn't decided exactly what he'd do when this moment came. He only knew that something had to change. "You've been spending a lot of time with Nosa," Orses said finally, his voice low and tightly wound. Sunday blinked, clearly not expecting the bluntness. "She's a good person," he said after a pause. "Easy to talk to." Orses stepped closer. The air between them shimmered with tension. "She's not just anyone, you know." Sunday shrugged, unaffected. "I know," he said, his voice annoyingly calm. "Why? Does that bother you?" The question hit Orses like a slap. He felt heat rise to his face, a raw mixture of embarrassment and rage. Something about Sunday's nonchalant tone made him want to lash out, to drag him down to the same stormy confusion that swirled inside his own chest. "Stay away from her," Orses muttered. His voice was so quiet, it took Sunday a moment to register what he'd said. Sunday tilted his head, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. Then, as if processing all that unspoken tension between them, he smiled, a slow, aggravatingly knowing smile. "Orses," Sunday said, his tone soft but edged with something sharp enough to cut. "I think you're making a big deal out of nothing. Nosa and I are friends. That's all. Friends don't touch each other like that." Orses snapped before he even realized the words had tumbled out. Sunday's eyes darkened, the smile vanishing. "Touch," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet now. "What are you trying to say?" Orses didn't answer. He couldn't. His hand tightened around the handle of the knife, though it remained hidden in his pocket. And then Sunday said something that made Orses' breath catch. "Orses, are you afraid she doesn't feel the same way about you?" The words slammed into him like a fist. Every inch of his being begged to lash out, to yell, to do something that could erase the smugness in Sunday's voice. Time seemed to slow. The world blurred and narrowed into a single point, this unbearable moment. His fingers gripped the knife harder, and before either of them could think further, someone else spoke. Sunday's voice cut through the silence first, sharp and edged with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his gaze narrowing. Orses stared at him, long, hard, and didn't answer right away. Silence was its own weapon, its own edge. Even if the rage bubbling inside him wanted to unleash words that would shatter the night. Orses let the silence linger until it became suffocating, then took one step closer. The wood beneath the porch groaned under his weight. "I came for the truth," Orses said finally, his voice calm, yet carrying venom. Sunday smirked, a lazy, confident smirk, the kind that baits people into bad decisions. He tucked his hands into the pockets of his coat and shook his head. It wasn't a dismissal, really. It was more like amusement. "And what truth is that, Orses? Is this about Nosa?" Her name, that name, hit Orses like a knife to the chest. He didn't flinch, but Sunday could see the way his jaw tightened. "Is this the part where you pretend you didn't know?" Orses asked bitterly. Or is it the part where you fake another lie to cover the last one? Sunday's smile grew wider, his eyes gleaming like a predator circling its prey. You think I owe you something? An explanation, maybe? Nosa and I... Well, she made her choice, Or says. You were always just the backup she kept in her back pocket. Her soft place to land. Her safety net. The words sucked the air out of the night. Orses took a step forward, his hands shaking now. But it wasn't fear. It was fury. The kind of fury that makes a person blind and reckless. You don't get to stand there, Orses growled, his voice low, trembling. You don't get to act like you're the only one who matters. People aren't little games you play, Sunday. They're not pawns you can discard when they don't fit your plan. Sunday straightened now, his smirk turning sharper. And what about you? He asked, his voice laced with mockery. Coming here, playing the hero, hoping maybe, just maybe, she'd pick you instead? Poor Orses, always the second option, always hoping for leftovers. That was it. That was the moment the dam broke. Orses lunged forward before his mind could catch up with his body. His hand grabbed Sunday by the collar and slammed him back against the porch railing. The wood creaked under their combined weight. For a brief moment, the air seemed to explode into chaos. The sound of broken breath, the impact of two forces colliding. But Sunday, ever quick, threw his arms up, shoving Orses back with surprising strength. Careful, Sunday barked, straightening his coat, his voice taking on a darker tone. You don't want to play this game, Orses. You're not ready. Orses stared at him, breathing hard, his mind a battlefield of emotions. The truth was, Sunday's words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Maybe he was right. Maybe Nosa never truly saw him as more than a shadow, as more than an option she could fall back on when the world turned against her. But that didn't mean Sunday could walk away from this unscathed. Before Orses could speak again, Sunday took a sudden step forward. His voice lowered, and it was as if all the arrogance had drained, replaced by something colder. Do you really think I care about you? About Nosa? All of this? It's just survival, Orses. You think you know me, but you have no idea what I've done. Don't think for a moment that she sees you as anything more than a convenience, Orses. Sunday's voice dripped with sarcasm. You're her backup plan, her safety net. Nothing more. Something inside Orses churned, a bitter cocktail of shame, hurt, and anger. Sunday laughed, an easy, careless laugh that made it clear he thought he'd already won. Orses's eyes darkened. You don't know anything, Orses said, his heart pounding. I know enough. Their eyes locked. Sunday's disdain pressed on Orses like a hand around his throat. Every word, every smirk from Sunday felt like another nail in his crumbling self-control. The ground beneath Orses seemed to shift, but Sunday remained rooted, cocky, and dismissive. You might think you have some claim on her, Sunday said, stepping closer. But Nosa isn't yours. She'll never be yours. That did it. Orses felt the shift inside him. Rage silenced reason. Before he could process the fire roaring in his chest, his hands moved as though possessed by something dark. He shoved Sunday hard, his palms hitting the other man's broad chest. Sunday stumbled backwards, unprepared for the strength behind the push. He caught his balance quickly and glared at Orses, his jaw clenched and his eyes flaring with something between disgust and amusement. Are you serious right now? Sunday said, brushing dirt from his shirt as if Orses's touch had soiled him. Orses's breathing was sharp and wild, like a cornered animal. He clenched and unclenched his fists as though trying to hold the storm inside him. It's just about Nosa, isn't it? Sunday said, his voice mocking. Grow up, Orses. You're like a child throwing tantrums. You may have her on the days she pities you, but she's already made her choice. You know it. I know it. And then Orses saw it. In Sunday's eyes, the pity. At that moment, the fire in Orses turned cold. That pity was worse than anger, worse than hate, because pity meant finality. It meant that in Sunday's mind, Orses was already a failure. His hands trembled, and his head spun. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His lips felt like stone. Sunday took a step closer and tilted his head. "You're pathetic, you know that?" The world could have ended at that moment, and Orses wouldn't have noticed. The edges of his vision blurred. His pulse raged in his ears like a war drum, and in the distance, he could hear something cracking. It was him. Orses never remembered the exact moment it happened. One moment, his hands hung limp at his sides. The next, there was a knife, a blade in his hand. It caught the dying light of the setting sun. The air seemed to shift, thicker, heavier, and then motion, a single, wild arc. The sound of the blade cutting through the air was startlingly quiet, but the next sound wasn't. A gasp escaped Sunday's lips. Low, wet. Orses froze as Sunday's eyes widened in horror. He took a staggering step backwards. His hands instinctively went to his stomach, where Orses had struck. Blood bloomed like an unforgiving flower against Sunday's white shirt. The metallic scent of blood hit Orses's nose, and nausea churned in his stomach. Sunday tried to speak, but only managed a broken noise that sent chills down Orses's spine. Sunday's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water before his legs gave out. The world spun. Sunday fell. Orses stood frozen, clutching the now-stained knife as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His chest rose and fell heavily, his breath ragged and shallow. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. His mind screamed at him to undo it, to go back. But time doesn't move backwards. The silence that followed was deafening. Orses stared at Sunday's lifeless body sprawled on the dirt, still staring up at the sky. Blood pooled beneath him, sinking into the unforgiving ground. For all his bravado, Sunday had been just as mortal as the rest of them. Orses tried to move, to run, to scream, anything. But he couldn't. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking violently, covered in blood. His mind replayed the moment. The knife. The arc. The gasp. It felt like some monstrous loop he couldn't escape. "I didn't mean to..." Orses whispered to no one. His voice cracked with each word. "I didn't mean to..." But the night wasn't listening. The stars twinkled indifferent and cold. His vision blurred with tears he hadn't realized were falling. Guilt clawed at his chest, threatening to rip him apart from the inside. And yet, somewhere deep within that guilt, there was something else. Something black and unfamiliar, whispering that Sunday deserved it for all his arrogance, his cruelty, his pity. But just as that corrosive thought took root, a sound shattered the silence. Nosa's scream, a piercing wail that tore through the still night air. Orses's head snapped up, his tear-streaked face contorting in shock. She stood in the doorway, horror etched into every part of her being. Her eyes darted from the knife in his hand to the lifeless body on the ground. "Orses, no." "And oh," she cried, rushing forward. She dropped to her knees beside Sunday, her trembling hands touching his blood-soaked chest as though trying to call him back to life. "Nosa, Orses began, stepping toward her. "Don't," she screamed, her voice filled with both fury and anguish. "What have you done?" I didn't mean to..." Orses stammered, trying to explain the inexplicable. He reached out for her, but she recoiled like his very touch burned her soul. Her sobs filled the air as she cradled Sunday's face. "Why?" she murmured, her voice small and broken. "Why would you do this?" Orses had no answer. The knife slipped from his hand and clattered to the ground. It sounded like a gunshot, reverberating in the empty night. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead. He wanted to speak, but his throat was a desert. Nosa's tears, Sunday's blood, the mangled pieces of what once was, it all merged into a suffocating weight pressing down on him. Somewhere far off, he heard the faint sound of approaching sirens. And for the first time in his life, Orses felt truly and utterly alone. They learned the hard way that unrequited love is the cause of most crimes connected to homicide, and that your worth isn't defined by someone else's feelings. Your value and identity extend far beyond one person's affection. Also, unrequited love doesn't mean you're unlovable. It often says more about the other person's circumstances, fears, or limitations. If you believe this, please leave a comment, share, subscribe to this channel, and turn on that bell notification. Thanks for watching to the end of this video. Who is your favorite character? Where are you watching us from? I'll see you in the next video. Stay bookie.